Welcome back. In this video, we're going to take a look at shading, and we'll also talk about how do you scale your images up and down, especially if you have multiple layers. So this is my canvas. It's 5100 pixels wide by 3300 pixels tall, and I've got a bunch of items on separate layers here, and I would like to be able to move them all. Now, because the grid layer is locked, I can't move it, so I have to first unlock it, and then I can hold down the Shift key, and this allows me to select multiple layers. And with that, I can go to the Move tool, keyboard shortcut V, and I can first move this over. If I want to simultaneously transform all of these objects together, either making them bigger or smaller, I would have to hold down Command or Control T, as in Tom. And doing that creates a blue bounding box, and I can simply just, if I just scale it, it should automatically work. If I hold down the Shift key, it kind of distorts it, so I don't recommend doing that. And in this way, we can make more room for our drawings. So that's the first thing that I wanted to share with you. Now, let's take a look at shading. This is going to be something that I would like for you to do in addition to indicating your contours. I want you to learn how to shade. And what we'll do is we'll start off by just making a very simple grid. Again, repetition is important. I'll make a small grid here, finding the midpoint. And when I'm locating the midpoint, I'm kind of eyeballing it, so it's not super important. I'm not going into any crazy detail by trying to measure things or, is it going to be a perfect grid? No. But what you're looking for here is, do the edges that are on the left and right hand side, do they eventually taper to a point? That's important. You don't want to just draw a grid like this because there's no implied perspective. So that's wrong. You don't want to do that. You want to always keep in mind that you're creating a surface. You're creating something that has dimension, and a grid has dimension. Unlike a line, if you were to just draw a line and place an object on a line, it's really hard to get a sense of the space unless you, for example, add a cast shadow or something along those lines. So that's why I recommend working with a grid as opposed to a line. So that being said, let's consider a simple example. I'll make a new layer here. I'll draw a box. In proper perspective. And so this box is on a separate layer from my grid, right? I would like you to always keep in mind that you want to keep each of your objects on a separate grid just for organizational purposes and flexibility to allow you to go ahead and move things as you need to. And now we'll talk about shading. So shading has to do with the areas that are not receiving light or not receiving direct light, right? So that would be ensconced in shadow. So if, for example, I were to draw something that resembles the sun, right? The sun is casting its rays towards the box. So what would happen is the top part of the box would actually receive light, and the side of the box would receive some of that light because it'll be bounced from the ground, but the area that's facing away from us will actually be in shaded, right? It will be colored in, it will be shaded. And the other thing is, so the shading is going to be on the surface of the object, and the shadows are going to be those things that are cast on the ground by the object. And shadows can be cast either on the ground or it can be cast on other objects themselves that are in the area. So in this case, I've got this rectangular object here. I'll make a new layer, and let's just think about how that shadow would cast. If the light is directly coming from the top right hand side, we might see the shadow looking something like this, right? That is the cast shadow. So how do we fill that space in a believable way? Well, when you're shading, what's really important is you want to think about the surface that you're shading on. For example, if I were to have just an item like this, just a standard edge or a grid, and if I were to shade it like this, that's not really matching the surface topology, because the surface topology is comprised of lines that are going horizontal and lines that are going vertical, right? So what would be recommended is to go ahead and at least shade along the contour. So you can shade it like this, and you can also shade it like that, right? This is just using lines, and I'll show you another method of shading. But it's important that the direction that you're shading in makes sense. You don't want to contradict the surface topology. Topology has to do with the way the surface is laid out. So getting back to shading this again. So what I'll do here is I'll go into my brush tools, and you should have in your your basic default brushes, there should be a soft round brush. And to be honest with you, and I've got a lot of brushes here, so, and many of those I've already erased, but what I do, you'll probably find something called soft round brush with opacity. And I don't have that particular brush over here, but you might see it on yours. In fact, let me see if I can just append default brushes. Boom. So that way I've got those back in here. So now we're on point. So I can look at my general brushes and choose my soft round pressure opacity brush. And there's also another one called soft round pressure opacity and flow. We'll talk about that one later. But when you click on that brush, notice that the brush takes on the basic shape. And what we're going to do is we're going to just gently use the right bracket key to make the brush a little bit bigger. And we're just going to shade in the direction of our shadow. And as I continue to press down on my tablet, it's dispensing more quote unquote ink, right? And then what I can do from here is I can also add some cast shadows right here. And if I wanted to make it darker, well, I can certainly do that. And this will be uniformly dark because it's a flat surface. And as we start moving away from the box, the shading will get progressively lighter. You won't see these lines here, but I'm just indicating them just so that you know where the shadow is. And we'll talk more about this in a bit, but this is the basic idea. The soft round brush is a really nice brush to have on hand, and you can again play with the darkness if you wish. You can also adjust the brush size. I like to make the brush just a little bit bigger. And what I also like to do, because everything is on nice and neat separate layers, I can go back in with the lasso tool, make a selection, and hit Command X to cut it to make that shadow crisp, right? So that's another example of using digital tools. You can really make it nice and neat. I'll just have to get rid of that line here. I'm using the R key to rotate. That's kind of like, I'll talk more about that later, but that's kind of a bonus tip for those of you that are paying attention. The R key lets you rotate your canvas, and then to get out of that rotation, you hit the escape key. So we'll talk about shading the other objects in the next video. I just want to keep these videos short and sweet. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.